Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am your host, Derek, and today we're going to take a look and talk about, based on this story of the Garden of Eden as we've been looking at it here, we're going to look at the question of what is sin, right? We've talked a lot about the idea of seeing this as the story of universal sin, and so to clarify for people again why we're looking at it that way is that when you look at a lot of the future New Testament references to this story, there's this idea of original sin that emerges from that. However, and I'll link back to that episode, but what we talked about in the episode where we discussed this concept of original sin is that what really matters from that concept is that it makes sin universal. So that really is the key element of this story, especially taking an approach that is ignoring whether or not it's historic or not, and looking at it historically with original sin creates this odd, genetic component to sin, very strange. So we're just looking at it as saying, hey, regardless of whether this happened historically or not, what really matters here, and what matters is that it's universal sin is what this story describes. That's what symbolically placing it in the forefather or the foreparents of all of us gets at that idea of this being universal sin. So we are going to take a look here at this sin, and we haven't talked about what this story might say about the universal nature of sin itself, right? What is sin? We've considered the pathways to sin, the route to sin, that occurs from both the masculine and the feminine perspectives, right? But in both cases, it's a singular sin that we're looking at, right? And we know that sin takes many forms. But if we're looking at this again as the story of universal sin, what might we look at the sin that occurs here, and see what that says about sin as a whole, right? So to that end, we're going to look at some characteristics, right? And the first characteristic we see here is that it is a violation of God's design or God's order, right? So what we see here in the story is that in God's order, they were not to eat the fruit of that tree at that particular time, right? It doesn't say whether sometime in the future maybe they will be allowed to or maybe not, right? Because in a way that question is irrelevant in some ways, right? Because it's a matter of, in this particular context, they were not to eat of that tree. And so that is something that I guess is important to realize as well, right? Violation of sin, I guess, is violation of God's design, is context dependent. There are some cases in which the design or God's order, if you will, allows for certain actions that might be sin under other contexts, other pretenses. The obvious example of this that we all sort of understand pretty easily is adultery, right? The idea that sex is designed for taking place within marriage, that is within God's order, and then outside of that context, it's the same act. Nothing has changed about what is done, but that same act then becomes sinful, right? It becomes a violation of the order. So we can look at that a little more. We can step back, I guess, one step further from that, and say that really then, if this is a universal sin, we might look at it and say that all sin is the use of God's creation outside of its intended purpose, right? That is, in effect, what sin is. Anything that is used outside of God's order. And so, to that extent, we have a tendency as Christians to look at the Bible sometimes and say, well, here's some list of sins, and so those are the things we shouldn't do. And if it's beyond that, it's some sort of, well, we can do those things. And it's like, well, maybe not, right? Maybe the question that we should be asking is, first and foremost, what is God's design? What is God's order for these things that we might use? And then would this or that use of it be outside of that order, right? And we'll get to some ways we might identify that in a second. But let's look at, for real quick here, then, what are some other characteristics that we see of sin in this story? The first one is obviously it's tempting, right? It is something that we desire. And maybe that desire doesn't necessarily have to itself be a negative, right? It's not that when the woman is looking at the fruit and sees that it's good to eat, right? And there would be a benefit to it. It's not that the desire of that benefit itself, which is really the source of the temptation, it's not that that was somehow wrong, right? Because there may be, I mean, God told them to eat the fruit of any of the trees. So the desiring of sustenance from fruit, right? And all of the pleasure that comes from eating the fruit was okay. It's just not in that particular context. And so the temptation itself is something we have to be wary of, because it plays on what may in fact be good instincts, but it perverts those good instincts. So the next thing we look at this story and we see is it has consequences. And this will begin to get into the idea of sort of identifying sin beyond what the Bible has explicitly laid out. But those consequences lead to death, and they destroy the world, right? And that is where we might be able to identify sin beyond the first few answers on the worksheet being filled in the Bible. What I mean by that is, one of the ways I sort of think of sin in the Bible is, when you're a kid, I'm sure some of you remember this, you get a math worksheet and you know, it's your times tables or something, and the first 3 answers are filled in, and then it's your job to fill in the rest of the worksheet, right? So it tells you what 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 2 is 2, 1 times 3, it's usually in that like gray dotted line, so you have to trace it, and then 1 times 4, 5, 6, those are your responsibility to then fill those in. But the pattern's been established for you. The pattern's been given for you in a way where you can look at that, study that pattern, and understand how to fill in the rest. That, I think, is what the Bible has given us in regards to sin. It's given us the sort of the principles, the patterns, right? I think this is a little bit what Jesus meant when he said he came to fulfill the law. He came to give us those sort of underlying patterns that would help us really understand the law and understand why we should take certain approaches towards things. And so one of the ways we can identify where sin may be occurring, where we've used something outside of God's order, is where the world is being destroyed, right? Wherever we see sort of that destruction, it's a product of using something outside of the way it was intended. Because when it's used the way it's intended, it builds the world up. It brings it more and more within to God's order. Right? It helps us subdue the earth, right? In that way that we were told we were meant to, right? But in those places where we can find the weeds and the thorns, right? We can find greater pain in childbirth, if you will. Where we can find those things, that's an indication of upstream of those, somewhere some sin has occurred. So that's the kind of thing where we should as Christians, who want to, build up the kingdom of heaven to the extent that we can, participate in the kingdom of heaven to the extent that we can, we should be looking at the world and seeing those places where things are broken, and understand we need to find where the sin occurred. What is the thing upstream of this that is causing that? And so when I say that, I do mean everything. I mean looking at everything, looking at mental health and understanding there was something upstream that is outside of God's order that led to the poor mental health or the struggling mental health. Frankly, physical health, right? I mean, sin leads to death in this story. There is a way in which, let's put it this way, right? God does love us. God cares for us. I don't think he would have designed us in a way such that if we were to do things within his order, it would lead to us destroying ourselves quicker. That doesn't make any sense. It's completely out of character with the idea of God presented in the Bible. The idea of God presented in the Bible is the more you do things in his order, the more you're built up. Right? Not to say that the world might not turn on you. There's plenty of stories of martyrdom, right? Plenty of stories of that, but sort of the self-created destruction, right? And so we understand this as Christians too, right? That's one of the reasons Christians look at the idea of rampant drug use, right? And say, well, that's a problem because that destroys the mind, it destroys the body. It's an act of poor stewardship, right? And so I think we need to maybe, as Christians, extend that out a little bit further, right? And consider stewardship as a whole, right? Is it our bodies, our environments, our neighborhoods? Are these things being built up by what we are doing? Are we creating a richer harvest? Or is it creating more weeds and thorns? So as Christians, we should be cognizant of the increased pain in childbirth, the thorns and the weeds around us, and look to those things for places where we might be acting outside of God's order, or others may be, or whatever, so that we can be people who are bringing solutions for those difficulties, right? If we look at the example of Christ, one of the things Christ did was brought solutions for people's pain and suffering, right? This is what we see in the act of Christ healing people, right? Symbolically, that's the idea of correcting the effects of sin. And that's one of the things that we as Christians should be doing. And like Christ, we should be trying to correct those things for people. Help with that. That doesn't mean force them to change, because, I mean, we see in the example of Christ, we don't see the example of forcing people to change, but we do see the example of someone who is helping people along that path. So that's something we should consider. And then lastly, it's worth it to note, I brought it up a couple times, but the existence of sin does not negate what we see in Genesis 1, right? That we are meant to act as the image of God, to multiply and fill the earth, and to subdue it. And so those things are not at all negated by the existence and the reality of sin. Now they become more difficult, that's for sure. That is undoubtedly the case. But that is still what we are meant to be doing. And even when Christ comes, that's not negated either. That is still very much, no, this is what you're meant to be doing. Now go forth and make disciples of that, but go do that too, right? Subdue the earth, multiply and fulfill it, act as the image of God. Those are the things we're meant to do, and that is true even in the presence of sin. So that's just some basics, I guess, in terms of how we're going to think about sin, especially moving forward through the rest of the Bible here, looking to this story for those basic ideas, right? The idea that sin has temptation, has consequences, and we're going to see those as we move forward, and the idea that when we look for sin, it's the use of God's creation outside of his perfect order, his intended purpose for those things. So, all right, with that, be sure to follow, like, subscribe, review. Go ahead and send an email, unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you in the next one. Thanks.